tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. Gary Becker stood in his mahogany-paneled home office, watching through the Venetian blinds as his wife, Casey, tended to her rose garden. 22 years of marriage, and she still looked beautiful in the morning light. Her auburn hair caught the sun as she bent over the flower beds, the same hair he'd run his fingers through on their wedding night. But Gary wasn't admiring his wife anymore. He was studying his target. 3 months ago, Gary had returned early from a business trip to find Casey's car gone and Hannah, their 16-year-old daughter, at her friend's house. The house felt different, charged with an energy that didn't belong. In their bedroom, he'd found a single cufflink under the bed, sterling silver with initials, DW. Gary Becker hadn't survived 15 years in military intelligence by ignoring details. That cufflink led him down a rabbit hole that shattered everything he thought he knew about his life. Drew Whalen, 34 years old, Casey's personal trainer turned lover. The affair had been going on for 8 months. Gary had documentation now, photos, hotel receipts, text messages recovered from deleted files. Casey thought she was clever, but Gary had taught interrogation techniques to CIA operatives. A cheating housewife was child's play. The irony wasn't lost on him. While Gary had spent decades serving his country, neutralizing threats to national security, the real enemy had been sleeping beside him every night. "Dad!" Hannah's voice broke his concentration. She stood in the doorway, backpack slung over her shoulder, keys in hand. "I'm going to Drew's gym. Mom said she might stop by after her garden work." Gary turned from the window, his expression carefully neutral. Hannah had inherited Casey's beauty, but his keen intelligence. She was a student with dreams of studying international relations, following in her father's footsteps. The thought of what he was about to do, what it would mean for Hannah, created a brief moment of hesitation. But Gary Becker had learned long ago that hesitation was weakness, and weakness got people killed. "Have fun, sweetheart," he said, kissing her forehead. "Tell your mother I'll be working late tonight." After Hannah left, Gary walked to his safe and retrieved a manila folder thick with evidence. But this wasn't about exposing their affair to friends and family. Public humiliation was for amateurs. Gary's revenge would be surgical, devastating, and permanent. He opened his laptop and began typing an encrypted message to Simon Salazar, a former colleague who now worked in private security. Simon owed Gary his life from a mission in Afghanistan, and Gary was about to collect on that debt. The message was simple: need a favor. Remember that discussion about untraceable evidence planting? It's time. Casey's laughter drifted through the window as she spoke on her phone. Gary recognized the tone, the same breathy whisper she'd once used with him. Now it was Drew on the other end, making plans for their afternoon rendezvous. Gary closed the laptop and walked to his bedroom closet. Behind his dress shirts, concealed in a false back, was his old service weapon and several items from his intelligence days. Things that officially didn't exist. He'd spent 3 months planning. Now it was time to execute. Chapter 2. Threads of Deception. Drew Whalen flexed in front of the gym's mirror, admiring the physique that had attracted Casey Becker 8 months ago. At 34, he was in the best shape of his life, and wealthy women like Casey were easy prey. She wasn't the first married client he'd seduced, and she wouldn't be the last. "Looking good, boss," said Alfredo Horton, Drew's business partner and co-owner of Elite Fitness. Alfredo was the brains behind their operation. Not just the gym, but their side business of blackmailing wealthy clients with compromising photos and videos. "Casey's coming by this afternoon," Drew said, adjusting his tank top. "Got the cameras ready?" Alfredo nodded toward the seemingly innocent security system. "Already rolling. Her husband's got serious money. Military contractor, right? This could be our biggest score yet." Drew had researched Gary Becker thoroughly. The man was worth over $2 million, with government contracts stretching back decades. Casey had no idea Drew's interest in her went beyond her body, though that was certainly part of the appeal. What Drew didn't know was that Gary Becker had been watching them both for months. At that moment, Simon Salazar sat in a van across the street, monitoring their conversation through sophisticated listening devices. Gary's former colleague was a master of electronic surveillance, and Elite Fitness's security system had been compromised weeks ago. Target confirmed. Simon spoke into his comm device. They're planning to record the wife for blackmail purposes. Gary's voice crackled back through the encrypted channel. Perfect. That gives us motive and opportunity. Proceed with Phase 2. Simon reached for a small device, a signal jammer that would create a brief window of vulnerability in the gym systems, long enough to plant the evidence Gary had prepared. Meanwhile, across town, Casey Becker finished her gardening and checked her reflection in the hall mirror. She'd lost 15 pounds since starting her sessions with Drew, but the real transformation was internal. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Gary had become distant, cold, buried in his work. He treated their marriage like another military operation, efficient, organized, emotionless. Drew made her feel desired, spontaneous, dangerous. She didn't know that Gary had been distant by design, slowly withdrawing his affection to push her toward the affair he'd already discovered. Every cold shoulder, every late night at the office, every time he claimed to be too tired for intimacy, it had all been calculated to drive her into Drew's arms more completely. Casey grabbed her gym bag and headed for the door, not noticing the small GPS tracker Gary had placed in her car or the nearly invisible cameras he'd installed throughout their home. At Elite Fitness, Simon had completed his work. Hidden in Drew's office locker were several items that would soon become crucial evidence. A bag of high-grade cocaine, detailed plans for a robbery targeting Gary's government contracts, and photos of other clients in compromising positions. But the masterstroke was the hard drive concealed behind a false panel in Drew's desk. It contained fabricated but convincing evidence of a larger conspiracy: drug distribution networks, money laundering schemes, and communications with known criminals. Gary had spent months creating this false digital history, using techniques he'd learned from creating cover identities for deep cover operatives. Drew and Alfredo would soon discover that their blackmail scheme was the least of their problems. As Casey pulled into the gym parking lot, she felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. She had no idea she was walking into a trap that had been months in the making, or that her husband was already 10 steps ahead of every move she thought was secret. Gary sat in his office, watching the tracking signals on his computer screen. Casey's car at the gym, Simon's van in position, everything proceeding according to plan. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 5 years. Kirk Rhodes, answered a gruff voice. Kirk, it's Gary Becker. I need a favor. Kirk Rhodes was a federal agent who specialized in drug trafficking cases. Gary had provided intelligence that helped Kirk break a major cartel operation in 2018. Another debt to be collected. Gary, good to hear from you. What do you need? I have intelligence on a drug operation with ties to blackmail and extortion. Elite Fitness on Maple Street. I think you'll find it very interesting. Gary hung up and checked his watch. Phase 2 was in motion. Soon, Drew and Casey would discover that their afternoon of passion was about to become the beginning of their nightmare. But first, Gary had one more call to make. To his daughter. Chapter 3. The Tightening Noose. Hannah Becker sat in her car outside Elite Fitness, staring at her phone. Her father's text message was cryptic. Emergency at home. Come back immediately. Don't go inside the gym. Trust me. She'd been about to walk in when the message arrived. Through the large windows, she could see her mother and Drew in what appeared to be an intimate conversation near the juice bar. Hannah had suspected something was going on. The late nights, her mother's new wardrobe, the constant text messages. But seeing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from her father. Hannah, where are you? Gary's voice was tight with controlled urgency. Outside the gym. Dad, I can see Mom with Drew, and don't go in there. Drive home now. There's something you need to know. Hannah started her car with shaking hands. Her perfect family was crumbling, and she didn't understand why. Inside Elite Fitness, Casey and Drew were oblivious to the storm gathering around them. They'd moved to Drew's office for privacy, unaware that every word was being recorded by Gary's surveillance equipment. When are you going to tell him? Drew asked, his hands wandering over Casey's body. Soon, Casey whispered. Gary's been so distant lately. I think he already suspects something. What they didn't know was that Gary wanted them to feel confident, secure in their deception. It would make their fall that much more devastating. In the gym's main area, Alfredo was dealing with an unexpected problem. The security system was glitching, showing false alarms and system errors. He called their tech support company, but they claimed no issues on their end. The glitches were Simon's work, creating a digital paper trail that would support the planted evidence. Every system error was logged, creating timestamps that would align perfectly with the criminal activity Gary had fabricated. At the federal building downtown, Kirk Rhodes was reviewing the intelligence package Gary had provided. It was comprehensive: financial records, communication logs, surveillance photos. If even half of it was accurate, Elite Fitness was a front for a significant criminal operation. Kirk didn't question the source. Gary Becker's intelligence had always been solid, and the evidence was too detailed to ignore. He began assembling a task force for a coordinated raid. Hannah burst through the front door of her house to find her father waiting in the living room. Gary's expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. "Sit down, Hannah." She collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing. "Dad, what's going on? Why couldn't I go into the gym?" Gary placed a manila folder on the coffee table between them. "Your mother has been having an affair with Drew Whalen for 8 months. The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. Even though she'd suspected, hearing it confirmed by her father made it real. "How do you know?" Gary opened the folder, revealing photos, hotel receipts, text message transcripts. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. "I've known for 3 months," Gary said quietly. "I've been gathering evidence." Hannah stared at the photos, her mother kissing Drew in a hotel parking lot, entering his apartment, leaving the next morning. Her perfect mother, the woman who taught her about honesty and integrity, was living a lie. "What are you going to do?" Hannah asked. Gary's expression was ice cold. "I'm going to destroy them both." The word sent a chill through Hannah. She'd never seen her father like this. Not angry, but something far more dangerous. Calculating. Methodical. "Dad, maybe we should just—" "There is no just, Hannah. Your mother betrayed our family. She betrayed 22 years of marriage. She betrayed you." Gary's voice was steady, but Hannah could see the fury burning behind his eyes. "And Drew Whalen thinks he can destroy my family for sport. They both need to learn that actions have consequences." Hannah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Running late, sweetheart. Don't wait up for dinner." Gary saw the message. "She's lying to you too, Hannah. Right now, while she's texting about running late, she's in bed with her lover. Are you going to defend that?" Hannah felt tears burning her eyes. Her family was falling apart, and her father was talking about revenge like it was a military operation. "What kind of consequences?" she whispered. Gary closed the folder. "The kind that ensure they never hurt us again." At that moment, Kirk Rhodes was briefing his team on the Elite Fitness operation. The raid was scheduled for the following morning. Gary's intelligence suggested the targets would be most vulnerable during their regular afternoon meeting. But Gary had also provided Kirk with additional intelligence: Drew Whalen's vehicle registration, his known associates, his daily patterns. Everything the federal agents would need to build an airtight case. As Hannah sat in shocked silence, processing the destruction of her family, Gary was already moving to the next phase. His phone displayed a message from Simon. "All packages delivered. Systems compromised. Targets unaware." Gary looked at his daughter, his brilliant, innocent daughter who was about to learn that the world was far crueler than she'd ever imagined. "Hannah, I need you to understand something. In this life, you're either the predator or the prey. Your mother chose to make us prey. I choose to be the predator." Hannah stared at her father, seeing a stranger where her protector used to be. "What does that mean?" Gary's smile was cold as winter. "It means tomorrow, your mother and Drew Whalen are going to discover what happens when you betray Gary Becker." Outside, storm clouds were gathering. But the real storm was about to break inside Elite Fitness, where two lovers had no idea their affair was about to cost them everything. Chapter 4. The Trap Springs. Casey Becker woke up in Drew's arms at 6 a.m., sunlight streaming through the blinds of his downtown apartment. For a moment, she felt pure contentment, until reality crashed back. She'd told Gary she was at her sister's house for the night. Another lie in an increasingly complex web of deception. "I have to go," she whispered, slipping out of bed. Drew pulled her back down. "Stay. Gary's probably already left for work anyway." Casey didn't know that Gary was indeed gone, but not to work. He was across the street in Simon's surveillance van, watching the apartment building and coordinating with Kirk Rhodes's federal task force. Teams Alpha and Bravo in position. Kirk's voice crackled through Gary's earpiece. Gary watched through high-powered binoculars as Casey finally emerged from the building at 7:30 a.m. She looked guilty, furtive, constantly checking her phone. "Perfect. She's leaving now," Gary reported. Drew should be departing for the gym within 30 minutes. The plan was intricate. Kirk's team would raid Elite Fitness at 9 a.m., discovering the planted evidence that would implicate Drew in drug trafficking and extortion. But Gary's revenge went deeper than a simple frame job. At home, Hannah was getting ready for school when her mother walked through the door, hair disheveled, makeup smeared. "Morning, sweetheart," Casey said, trying to sound casual. "How was your night?" Hannah stared at her mother, this woman who'd raised her to value honesty above all else. "Fine. Dad left early for work." Casey nodded, heading upstairs to shower. She didn't notice Hannah filming her with her phone, documenting the obvious signs that she'd spent the night elsewhere. Gary had asked Hannah to gather evidence, and despite her conflicted feelings, she'd agreed. At Elite Fitness, Drew was reviewing the gym's financials when Alfredo burst into his office. "We've got problems," Alfredo panted. The security system logged 23 unauthorized access attempts last night. "Someone's been trying to hack us." Drew frowned. Their blackmail operation required absolute security. If someone had compromised their systems, run a full diagnostic, Drew ordered. "Check everything. Cameras, files, the works." What they found terrified them. Their supposedly secure servers had been infiltrated. Worse, someone had been copying their files for weeks. All their blackmail materials, all their victim profiles, everything. "We need to shut down operations," Alfredo said. "Delete everything and disappear." But it was too late. As they frantically tried to purge their systems, Kirk Rhodes's task force was already surrounding the building. Gary watched from his position as black SUVs blocked every exit. This was the moment he'd been planning for months, the systematic destruction of everyone who'd betrayed him. Federal agents. Kirk's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Everyone exit the building with your hands visible." Inside the gym, chaos erupted. Drew and Alfredo tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Within minutes, they were both in handcuffs as federal agents swarmed the building. Kirk Rhodes personally searched Drew's office, following Gary's detailed intelligence. The hidden cocaine was found exactly where Simon had planted it. The fabricated robbery plans were discovered in Drew's desk. The hard drive containing months of falsified criminal communications was recovered from behind the false panel. "Drew Whalen, you're under arrest for drug trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit robbery," Kirk announced. Drew's face went white. "This is insane. I don't know what any of this is." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The evidence was overwhelming and convincing. Gary had spent months crafting a perfect frame, using techniques learned from decades of intelligence work. From the surveillance van, Gary called Hannah. "Turn on the news." Hannah was in her first period chemistry class when she saw the breaking news alert on her phone. Local gym owners arrested in major drug bust. Her stomach dropped as she saw Drew's face on the screen, being led away in handcuffs. The reporter was describing a complex criminal operation involving drug trafficking and blackmail. Gary's voice was calm when she called him. "Phase 1 complete. Dad, this is insane. You framed them." "I exposed them," Gary corrected. Drew Whalen was running a blackmail operation, using the gym as a front. He was recording clients in compromising positions and extorting money from them. The drugs were just a bonus. Hannah felt sick. What about the robbery plans? The other charges? Fabricated but believable. By the time their lawyers sort through the real evidence and the planted evidence, they'll be in prison for years. "This is wrong, Dad." Gary's voice turned cold. What's wrong? Is your mother destroying our family for a criminal? What's wrong is being betrayed by the people you trust most. At the federal building, Casey arrived in a panic after seeing the news. She'd been trying to call Drew all morning, getting only voicemail. "I need to see Drew Whalen," she told the desk sergeant. "I'm a friend." The sergeant looked at her with suspicion. "He's been arrested on federal charges. No visitors allowed." Casey felt her world collapsing. The man she'd been planning to leave her husband for was allegedly running a criminal empire. How had she been so blind? But Gary wasn't finished. As Casey sat in her car outside the federal building, crying and confused, her phone rang. "Mrs. Becker?" The voice was official, authoritative. "This is Agent Martha Guzman with the FBI. We need to speak with you immediately." Gary had provided Kirk's team with Casey's information, suggesting she might be involved in Drew's operation. After all, she was his most frequent client, and their relationship clearly went beyond fitness training. "I don't understand," Casey stammered. "Ma'am, we have evidence suggesting you may have knowledge of Mr. Whalen's criminal activities. We need you to come in for questioning." Casey's hand shook as she drove to the FBI field office. Her affair was about to become public knowledge, her reputation destroyed, her marriage over. But she still didn't realize this was all Gary's orchestration. At home, Gary was preparing for Casey's return. He'd moved all her belongings to the guest room and changed the locks on their bedroom. Her credit cards were canceled, her access to their joint accounts suspended. But the cruelest touch was the letter he'd left on her pillow. Divorce papers, already filed, along with a detailed accounting of her affair and a custody petition that would paint her as an unfit mother. Gary Becker had spent 15 years eliminating threats to national security. Now he was eliminating threats to his family with the same methodical precision. The war had begun, and Gary intended to win. Chapter 5: Collateral Damage. Agent Martha Guzman led Casey into a sterile interrogation room at the FBI field office. Casey's hands trembled as she sat across from the stern-faced agent, her perfect suburban life crumbling around her. "Mrs. Becker, how long have you known Drew Whalen?" Martha asked, opening a thick file. "About 8 months," Casey whispered. "He's my personal trainer." Martha slid several photographs across the table. Casey entering Drew's apartment, leaving hotels together, kissing in parking lots. Casey's face went ashen as she realized the extent of the surveillance. "Just a personal trainer?" Martha's voice was skeptical. Casey broke down completely. "We were having an affair, but I swear I didn't know about any criminal activity." What Casey didn't know was that Martha Guzman was another piece in Gary's elaborate chess game. Martha and Gary had worked together on several classified operations, and she owed him favors that could never be officially acknowledged. "Mrs. Becker, your husband contacted us 3 months ago with concerns about unusual activity at Elite Fitness," Martha said, delivering the lie with practiced sincerity. "He was worried you might be in danger." The statement was masterfully crafted. It made Gary appear concerned and protective while simultaneously revealing Casey's affair to federal authorities. It also established a timeline that made Gary seem like the wrong party trying to protect his family. Gary knew. Casey's voice was barely audible. "He's been very cooperative with our investigation," Martha continued. "He provided us with financial records showing unusual deposits in your personal account. Deposits that coincide with your visits to Elite Fitness." This was another fabrication. Simon had hacked Casey's bank records and created false transaction histories that made it appear she'd been receiving payments from Drew's operation. To investigators, it would look like she was being compensated for her involvement in his crimes. Casey stared at the fabricated bank statements, her world spinning out of control. "I never received any money from Drew. This is impossible. Mrs. Becker, we have evidence suggesting you may have been used as a courier for Mr. Whalen's drug distribution network. Your frequent visits to his apartment, the cash deposits, your access to upscale social circles. It all fits the pattern." Casey realized she was being framed. But by whom? Drew for his crimes? The FBI for a case they couldn't prove? She had no idea her own husband was orchestrating her destruction. Meanwhile, at Hannah's high school, news of the Elite Fitness bust was spreading rapidly. Several students had parents who were clients at the gym, and rumors were flying about the blackmail operation. Hannah sat alone at lunch, staring at her phone. Her father had sent her a link to a news article about the investigation. Buried in the fourth paragraph was a mention of several individuals being questioned in connection with the case, including family members of clients. Her mother was being investigated as a potential criminal. Hannah's phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Come home after school. We need to talk." When Hannah arrived home, she found Gary in his office with a man she didn't recognize, a tall, well-dressed attorney with cold eyes. "Hannah, this is Charles Ramsey, our family attorney," Gary said. "He needs to ask you some questions." Charles opened a legal pad and studied Hannah with calculating precision. "Hannah, I need you to understand that your mother is facing serious federal charges. She may go to prison for a very long time." Hannah felt the world tilt beneath her. Prison. The FBI believes she was involved in Drew Whalen's criminal enterprise, Charles continued. They have evidence of cash payments, frequent contact, knowledge of his activities. The situation is very serious. Gary watched his daughter's face carefully, noting every expression, every tear. He needed Hannah completely on his side for the next phase of his plan. "But there's a way to help her," Charles said. "If you can provide testimony about your mother's recent behavior, her absences, her lies, any suspicious activity, it might help establish that she was a victim of manipulation rather than a willing participant." Hannah looked between her father and the attorney, sensing something wrong, but unable to identify what it was. "You want me to testify against Mom?" "We want you to tell the truth," Gary said quietly. "About the lies, the secret phone calls, the nights she didn't come home. The truth might be the only thing that saves her from a lengthy prison sentence." Hannah felt trapped. Her mother had lied to her, betrayed their family, but testifying against her felt like another betrayal entirely. Back at the FBI field office, Casey was being processed for release, pending further investigation. Her affair was now a matter of federal record, her reputation destroyed, her life in ruins. But Gary's revenge was far from complete. As Casey drove home, her phone rang constantly. Reporters, neighbors, friends who'd seen the news. She ignored them all, focused only on getting home to confront Gary and try to salvage something from the wreckage. She pulled into her driveway to find the locks changed and her belongings piled on the front porch. A process server was waiting with divorce papers and a restraining order that barred her from entering the house. "Casey Becker," the server asked. "You've been served." Casey stared at the legal documents through tears. Gary was divorcing her, seeking full custody of Hannah, and freezing all their assets pending the outcome of the federal investigation. She called Gary's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. His message was cold and formal. "You've made your choices, Casey. Now live with the consequences." Casey sat in her car outside the home she'd lived in for 22 years, watching her teenage daughter's silhouette in her bedroom window. Everything she'd built, everything she'd cherished was gone. But she still didn't realize that Gary had orchestrated every moment of her downfall, that her husband had become her most dangerous enemy. Inside the house, Gary was already planning Phase 3. Casey and Drew were neutralized, but Gary's revenge required total victory. He needed to ensure they could never threaten his family again. He opened his laptop and began researching federal prison systems, looking for facilities where Drew and Casey would serve their sentences. Gary had contacts in the prison system, former military colleagues who transitioned to corrections work. If Casey and Drew thought their arrests were the end of their punishment, they were gravely mistaken. Gary Becker's revenge was just beginning. Chapter 6: The Point of No Return. Drew Whalen sat in his federal holding cell, staring at the concrete walls and trying to understand how his life had imploded in a single day. His court-appointed attorney, Ronald Zimmerman, had just delivered devastating news. "They've got you cold, Drew," Ronald said bluntly. "The evidence is overwhelming. Drugs, blackmail materials, communications with known criminals, plans for armed robbery. We're looking at 25 to life. But none of it's mine," Drew protested. "Someone planted all of this." Ronald shrugged. "That's what they all say. The cocaine alone is enough for a major trafficking charge and the blackmail operation. Jesus, Drew, you had compromising photos of half the city's elite. What Ronald didn't mention was that Gary Becker had personally recommended him to Drew's family, presenting him as a skilled defense attorney when he was actually incompetent and working against his client's interests. Meanwhile, Casey had spent the night in a cheap motel, her credit cards frozen and her access to their joint account suspended. She tried calling her sister, her friends, anyone who might help, but word of her federal investigation had spread quickly through their social circle. At 8 a.m., her phone rang. The caller ID showed her attorney's office. "Casey, this is Deanna Lawrence," the voice said. "I'm with Lawrence & Associates. Your husband hired us to represent you in the federal matter." Casey felt a surge of hope. Maybe Gary was trying to help her after all. "Thank God. I need to see you immediately." "Of course. Can you come to our office this morning?" What Casey didn't know was that Deanna Lawrence was another piece in Gary's elaborate game. She was a legitimate attorney, but she'd been specifically chosen for her aggressive tactics and willingness to sabotage her own clients when properly motivated. At the Lawrence & Associates office, Casey poured out her story to Deanna: the affair, the arrests, the federal investigation. She maintained her innocence regarding any criminal activity. Deanna listened sympathetically, taking detailed notes. "Casey, I need to be honest with you. The evidence against you is substantial. The FBI has financial records showing payments from Drew's operation, surveillance photos, communication logs. But I never received any money, and I had no idea about his criminal activities." "I believe you," Deanna said soothingly, "but proving your innocence will be difficult. However, there might be another option." Deanna slid a document across the desk. "A plea agreement. If you cooperate fully with the investigation, provide testimony against Drew, and accept responsibility for your involvement, the prosecutors might reduce the charges significantly." Casey stared at the document. It was a confession, admitting to knowledge of Drew's crimes, accepting payments for her participation, and agreeing to testify against him. "If I don't sign this, you'll likely face the same charges as Drew. 25 years to life." Casey's hands shook as she signed the document, not realizing she was signing her own destruction. The plea agreement was fabricated, designed to create a false confession that would destroy any chance of mounting a legitimate defense. Back at home, Gary was having breakfast with Hannah when his phone buzzed with a message from Deanna. "Document signed. Phase 6 complete." Hannah noticed her father's satisfied smile. "Dad, what's going to happen to Mom?" Gary buttered his toast carefully. "Your mother made choices, Hannah. Now she has to accept responsibility for those choices." "But what if she goes to prison?" Gary looked at his daughter with cold calculation. Hannah was becoming a problem. Her sympathy for Casey could complicate his plans. It was time to ensure Hannah's complete loyalty. "Hannah, I need to show you something." Gary led Hannah to his office and opened his laptop. On the screen was a video, security footage from Elite Fitness showing Casey and Drew in intimate situations. Hannah turned away, horrified. "Dad, I don't want to see this." "You need to understand who your mother really is," Gary said firmly. "This is what she chose over our family. Over you." Hannah began crying, but Gary wasn't finished. He showed her bank records, the fabricated ones Martha had presented, text messages between Casey and Drew discussing their future together, hotel receipts spanning months. "She was planning to leave us, Hannah. Leave you. For a criminal who was using her for blackmail and drug money." The lies were masterfully constructed, each one designed to poison Hannah's relationship with her mother permanently. Gary needed Hannah to hate Casey as much as he did. "I don't want to see her anymore," Hannah said through tears. Gary pulled his daughter close, feeling a moment of genuine affection mixed with satisfaction. "You don't have to, sweetheart. I'll protect you from now on." That afternoon, Casey was arrested again, this time for violating the terms of her release by attempting to contact Drew while he was in federal custody. The violation was fabricated, but the signed confession made it believable. As Casey was led away in handcuffs for the second time in 2 days, reporters swarmed the scene. Her arrest was broadcast on local news, her face plastered across social media as a suburban housewife turned criminal accomplice. Gary watched the coverage from his office, noting every detail. Casey's humiliation was complete, but her punishment was just beginning. He opened a secure messaging app and sent a final instruction to his network of contacts. Target secured. Proceed to final phase. In federal prison, Drew Whalen was about to discover that Gary Becker's influence extended far beyond the courtroom. And Casey was about to learn that her husband's revenge had no limits, no mercy, and no end. Gary looked out his office window at the rose garden Casey had tended so carefully. Tomorrow, he would have it torn out and replaced with something new, something that belonged to his life moving forward, not the life Casey had destroyed. Hannah knocked on his door. "Dad? The news is saying Mom might get 25 years. Gary turned from the window, his expression serene. "That's not our concern anymore, Hannah. Casey Becker chose her path. Now she has to walk it." Hannah nodded, her face hardening with an expression that reminded Gary of himself. Good. She was learning. The war was nearly over, and Gary Becker had won completely. Chapter 7. The Final Betrayal. 6 months later, Gary Becker sat in the visitor's room of the Federal Correctional Institution, watching Casey through reinforced glass. She looked hollow, broken, aged years in just half a year. The federal prison system had not been kind to the former suburban housewife. "Why are you here, Gary?" Casey asked through the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. Gary studied his former wife. He corrected himself. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, with Gary retaining full custody of Hannah and all marital assets. "I wanted to see how you were adjusting," Gary said calmly. Casey laughed bitterly. "Adjusting? I'm serving 15 years for crimes I didn't commit. Drew got life without parole. Our lives are destroyed by whoever framed us." Gary's expression didn't change. "No one framed you, Casey. You made choices. You betrayed our marriage, our family, our daughter. Everything that happened was a consequence of those choices. I had an affair, Gary. I didn't traffic drugs or blackmail people or plan robberies." Gary leaned forward slightly. "Didn't you?" Something in his tone made Casey's blood run cold. She stared at her husband's face, noting the cold satisfaction in his eyes, the slight smile playing at his lips. "What are you saying?" Gary was quiet for a long moment, savoring this instant. He'd waited months for this conversation, the moment when Casey would finally understand the scope of his revenge. "I'm saying that your affair was just the beginning of your betrayal. Everything else, the drugs, the blackmail, the robbery plans, that was all real, Casey. You just didn't know about it." Casey's hands began shaking. "You're lying. Drew really was running a blackmail operation. He really was planning to rob my government contracts. The drugs were his side business." Gary's voice was matter-of-fact, conversational. "I just enhanced the evidence, made sure the authorities found everything." The truth crashed over Casey like a physical blow. "You framed us." "I exposed the truth and added some creative details," Gary corrected. "Drew was using you, Casey. He was recording your sessions, planning to blackmail me through you. You were never his lover. You were his mark." Gary reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet, showing Casey surveillance footage from Elite Fitness. She watched in horror as Drew and Alfredo discussed their plan to seduce her, record her, and extract money from Gary. "This is from 3 months before your affair began," Gary said. "He targeted you specifically because of my wealth and security clearance. Every moment you thought was love was actually him executing a con." Casey stared at the footage, watching Drew laugh as he described her as desperate and gullible. Her world shattered completely. "But you let it happen," she whispered. "You knew, and you let me walk into his trap." Gary's smile was ice cold. "I didn't let it happen, Casey. I made it happen. I wanted you to fall for his scheme so I could destroy you both." The full scope of Gary's manipulation was staggering. He discovered Drew's plan early and, instead of stopping it, had encouraged it. Gary had been the one to suggest Casey needed a personal trainer. He'd recommended Elite Fitness specifically. He'd even created opportunities for the affair by working late and traveling more frequently. "You orchestrated everything," Casey said in dawning horror. "Every moment," Gary confirmed. "Your affair, Drew's criminal activities, the federal investigation, your arrest, your confession. All of it was my design." Casey felt physically ill. Why? Why would you do this to me? Gary's expression turned deadly serious. Because you betrayed me, Casey. You betrayed our marriage, our family, our daughter. And I don't forgive betrayal. I was lonely. You've been distant for months. I made a mistake, but I didn't deserve this. You made a choice, Gary said firmly. You chose to destroy our family. I chose to destroy you first. Casey began crying, but Gary wasn't finished. He had one more revelation that would complete her psychological destruction. Hannah knows, he said quietly. Casey looked up, tears streaming down her face. Knows what? Everything. She knows about your affair, your criminal conviction, your betrayal of our family. She testified at your sentencing hearing about your lies and absences. She asked the judge to give you the maximum sentence. The words hit Casey like bullets. No, Hannah wouldn't. Hannah hates you, Casey. She sees you as the woman who destroyed our family for money and drugs. She believes you're a criminal who chose strangers over your own daughter. Gary pulled out his phone and showed Casey a text message from Hannah. Dad, I'm so glad you protected us from her. I never want to see her again. Casey collapsed forward, sobbing uncontrollably. Her daughter, her beautiful, brilliant daughter, had been turned against her completely. She won't take your calls, Gary continued mercilessly. She refuses your letters. She's changed her name legally. She's Hannah Rhodes now, taking my mother's maiden name. As far as she's concerned, Casey Becker died the day you chose Drew over your family. Casey looked up at Gary through her tears, finally seeing him clearly for the first time. This wasn't her husband, the man she'd married 22 years ago. This was a predator, a monster who'd systematically destroyed her life with surgical precision. You're insane, she whispered. Gary stood up, straightening his jacket. I'm thorough. There's a difference. He paused at the door, looking back at Casey one final time. Oh, and Casey? Drew sends his regards. I had a conversation with him last week. He wanted you to know that he never cared about you, never loved you, and he blames you entirely for his situation. He says you're pathetic. Gary walked away, leaving Casey alone in the visitor's room, surrounded by the wreckage of her former life. But Gary's revenge still wasn't complete. As he drove home, he thought about Hannah, who was waiting for him with her acceptance letter to West Point. She would follow in his footsteps, become the child he'd always wanted her to be. Hannah had chosen him over Casey, just as he'd planned. But she didn't know that her choice had been manufactured, manipulated, orchestrated by her father's psychological warfare. Gary Becker had won completely. Casey would serve 15 years in federal prison. Drew would die behind bars. Hannah belonged to him alone. But in the back of his mind, Gary wondered if his brilliant daughter would someday discover the truth about his manipulations. And if she did, what choice would she make then? For now, it didn't matter. Gary had eliminated every threat to his family, destroyed every enemy, secured every victory. He was the predator, and everyone else was prey. Chapter 8. Sins of the Father. 2 years after Casey's imprisonment, Hannah Rhodes, formerly Hannah Becker, stood in her father's study, holding a manila folder that would destroy everything she thought she knew about her family. At 18, Hannah had inherited her father's intelligence and her mother's intuition. She was weeks away from starting at West Point, following the path Gary had carefully laid out for her. But first, she decided to organize his home office while he was on a business trip. That's when she found a hidden safe behind his bookshelf, and inside it, the evidence of Gary's elaborate revenge scheme. Hannah spread the documents across Gary's desk with shaking hands. Bank records showing payments to Simon Salazar for intelligence services. Communication logs between Gary and Agent Martha Guzman discussing the fabrication of evidence. Detailed plans for framing Drew and Casey, complete with timelines and objectives. But the most damaging document was Gary's personal journal, written in his precise handwriting. Day 127. Casey took the bait perfectly. Her guilt about the affair makes her easy to manipulate. Hannah's testimony about her mother's absences was particularly effective at the sentencing hearing. I've successfully turned my daughter into a weapon against her own mother. Day 203. Drew's prison contacts report he's been placed in general population. The inmates I've paid will ensure he doesn't survive his first year. Casey will learn about his death next month. Another psychological blow to complete her destruction. Day 288. Hannah continues to excel academically and shows no signs of questioning the official narrative. Her hatred for Casey remains strong. I've successfully severed their relationship permanently. Phase 7 complete. Hannah read entry after entry detailing Gary's methodical destruction of her mother's life. The planted evidence, the fabricated charges, the manipulation of federal agents, the corruption of attorneys, all of it meticulously planned and executed. But the entry that broke her heart completely was dated 6 months ago. Hannah asked about visiting Casey for the first time since the trial. I showed her fabricated letters supposedly from Casey, blaming Hannah for testifying and calling her a traitor to the family. Hannah cried for hours and swore never to contact her mother again. It was almost too easy. My daughter's love for her mother is now permanently converted to hatred. The transformation is complete. Hannah remembered that day. She'd been feeling guilty about her mother, wondering if she'd been too harsh in her testimony. The letters had destroyed any sympathy she'd felt, convincing her that Casey was a narcissist who blamed everyone but herself for her crimes. But the letters were fake. Her father had written them himself. Hannah's phone buzzed with a text from Gary. Flight delayed. Home, tomorrow evening. Order dinner for 2. We'll celebrate your West Point departure. Hannah stared at the message, seeing her father's words with new understanding. He wasn't celebrating her achievement. He was celebrating his victory over Casey and his successful manipulation of his own daughter. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 2 years. Federal Correctional Institution. How may I help you? I'd like to schedule a visit with an inmate. Casey Becker. The drive to the federal prison took 3 hours, giving Hannah time to process the magnitude of her father's deception. She testified against her own mother based on lies. She turned her back on the woman who'd raised her, loved her, protected her. And she'd done it all because she trusted her father completely. Casey looked terrible when she entered the visitor's room. Prison had aged her dramatically, but it was the broken look in her eyes that devastated Hannah. This wasn't the vibrant, loving mother she remembered. This was a shell of a woman destroyed by betrayal and loss. Hannah. Casey's voice was uncertain, hopeful, heartbroken. Hannah sat across from her mother, seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Casey nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. Did you ever blame me for testifying against you? Did you ever call me a traitor or say you hated me? Casey's face crumpled. Never. Never, Hannah. I wrote you letters every week for 2 years, telling you I loved you, begging you to visit, asking for your forgiveness. You never responded. I never got any letters from you, Hannah whispered. I sent them to the house, to your school, to your friends' houses. Dozens of them. Hannah pulled out the fabricated letters Gary had shown her, the ones supposedly from Casey, filled with blame and hatred. Did you write these? Casey read them with growing horror. I never wrote these. Hannah, I would never say these things to you. I love you more than my own life. Hannah began crying as the full scope of her father's manipulation became clear. He'd intercepted Casey's real letters and replaced them with fake ones designed to destroy their relationship. Mom, I have something to tell you about Dad, about what really happened. For the next hour, Hannah laid out everything she discovered in Gary's study. Casey listened in stunned silence as her daughter described the elaborate frame job, the corrupted federal agents, the planted evidence, the psychological manipulation. He destroyed us both, Hannah said, and he made me help him do it. Casey reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand through the security barrier. Hannah, you were 17 years old. You trusted your father. This isn't your fault. I testified against you. I told the judge you were a terrible mother. I said you chose drugs and criminals over your family. You believe what you were told by someone you trusted, Casey said firmly. Gary spent months poisoning you against me. You were a victim too. Hannah squeezed her mother's hand. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to expose what he did. Casey's expression grew worried. Hannah, Your father is dangerous. If he discovers you know the truth, he already destroyed our family. What else can he do? Casey looked at her brilliant, brave daughter and felt both pride and terror. Hannah, promise me something. Whatever you decide to do, be careful. Your father has killed people. He won't hesitate to hurt you if you threaten his carefully constructed world. Hannah drove home in silence, her mind racing with plans. She had evidence of Gary's crimes, but she needed help from someone with authority and influence. Someone her father couldn't manipulate or corrupt. Back in Gary's study, she made copies of everything in the safe. Then she opened her laptop and began researching federal whistleblower protections, corruption investigations, and appeals processes for wrongful convictions. Gary Becker had taught his daughter to be methodical, thorough, and ruthless in pursuing objectives. Now Hannah would use those lessons against him. Her phone buzzed with another text from Gary. Can't wait to see you tomorrow, sweetheart. So proud of the woman you become. Hannah stared at the message, feeling a cold rage building inside her. The same calculating fury she'd inherited from her father. Gary had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate revenge scheme. He'd assumed Hannah would remain his loyal daughter forever, never questioning his version of events. But Hannah was 18 now, legally an adult, and she'd inherited her father's intelligence along with her mother's moral compass. The war Gary thought he'd won was about to begin again. And this time, he would discover what it felt like to be hunted by someone who knew all his tactics. Hannah began typing an encrypted email to the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, attaching copies of all the evidence she'd found. The subject line read, Evidence of Federal Agent Corruption and Conspiracy, Gary Becker Investigation. Tomorrow, when Gary returned home expecting to celebrate his victory, he would instead face the consequences of underestimating his own daughter. Hannah had learned to be a predator from the best teacher in the world. Now Gary was about to become a prey. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. Gary Becker's flight touched down at Reagan National Airport at 6:47 p.m., 2 hours late due to weather delays. He'd spent the flight reviewing classified documents for a new government contract, feeling satisfied with his carefully ordered life. Casey was serving year 3 of her 15-year sentence, broken and forgotten. Drew had died 6 months ago in a prison fight, exactly as Gary had arranged. Hannah was thriving at West Point, following the path he designed for her. Everything was perfect. Gary's phone showed 17 missed calls from Hannah, which struck him as unusual. She typically texted rather than called, and never with such frequency. He dialed her number as his car's service navigated D.C. traffic. Dad! Hannah's voice was strained, urgent. Hannah, what's wrong? You called 17 times. Where are you? Are you still on the plane? Just landed. I'll be home in 40 minutes. What's going on? Hannah was quiet for a moment. Dad, there are federal agents at the house. They have a search warrant. Gary felt his blood turn to ice. What kind of agents? FBI Internal Affairs. They're looking for documents related to the Elite Fitness investigation. Dad, they know about Agent Guzman, about Simon Salazar, about all of it. Gary's mind raced through possibilities. Someone had exposed his operation. But who? Everyone involved owed him favors or was compromised. There shouldn't be any loose ends. Hannah, listen to me carefully. Go to your room and pack a bag. Don't talk to the agents. Don't answer any questions. I'll handle this when I get home. Dad, Hannah's voice broke. I need to tell you something. Gary heard something in his daughter's tone that made his stomach clench. What is it? I found your safe. I read your journal. I know what you did to Mom. The words hit Gary like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, recognizing the tactical error that would destroy him. He'd underestimated his own daughter. Hannah, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Hannah said, her voice growing stronger. You framed Mama Drew. You corrupted federal agents. You manipulated me into testifying against my own mother. You destroyed our family for revenge. Gary's driver looked at him in the rearview mirror, noting his passenger's pale complexion and labored breathing. Hannah, everything I did was to protect our family. You did it to protect your ego. Hannah's voice cracked with emotion. Mom made a mistake, but you destroyed her life. You made me hate the woman who raised me. You turned me into a weapon against my own mother. Gary felt his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. What did you do? I called the FBI. I gave them copies of everything in your safe. Your journal, your communications with corrupt agents, your payments to Simon Salazar, all of it. Gary's phone showed an incoming call from Agent Kirk Rhodes. He let it go to voicemail, but the message was brief and devastating. Gary, you need to turn yourself in immediately. We have evidence of serious federal crimes. Don't make this worse than it already is. Hannah, you've made a terrible mistake, Gary said, trying to maintain control. Those documents are classified. You've committed federal crimes by copying them. Actually, I haven't, Hannah replied. I consulted with a federal prosecutor before I acted. Everything I did falls under whistleblower protections for reporting corruption and civil rights violations. Gary realized his daughter had outmaneuvered him completely. She'd inherited his strategic thinking, but applied it against him with devastating effectiveness. Where are you now? Gary asked. Somewhere safe. Dad, I'm giving you one chance to do the right thing. Turn yourself in. Confess to what you did. Help get Mom's conviction overturned. Gary laughed bitterly. The right thing? Hannah, your mother betrayed our family. She chose a criminal over us. Everything I did was justified. Mom made a mistake. You committed felonies. There's a difference. Gary's car pulled into his driveway, where 8 federal vehicles were parked. Agents swarmed his property, carrying boxes of evidence from his house. Hannah, I need you to understand something. I did this for you, to protect you from the kind of people who would destroy everything we built. You did this for yourself, Hannah said quietly, because you can't stand being betrayed, even when the betrayal is choosing someone else over your coldness. Gary saw Agent Kirk Rhodes approaching his car. Through the phone, he could hear Hannah crying. Dad, I loved you. I trusted you completely. But what you did to Mom, what you made me do to her, I can't forgive that. Hannah, I'm going to visit Mom tomorrow. I'm going to tell her I'm sorry for believing your lies. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for the damage I helped you cause. Gary felt something break inside his chest, not physical, but fundamental. His daughter, his greatest achievement, his perfect ally, had become his greatest enemy. Hannah, please. Goodbye, Dad. The line went dead as Kirk Rhodes tapped on Gary's car window. Gary Becker, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, and corruption of federal officers. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Gary thought about the journal entry he'd written just last week. Victory is complete. All enemies neutralized. Family secured. He'd been wrong about everything. 6 months later, Gary Becker sat in the same federal courtroom where Casey had been sentenced 3 years earlier. But this time, he was the defendant facing a life sentence for his crimes. Hannah sat in the gallery, wearing her West Point uniform. She deferred her enrollment to focus on overturning her mother's conviction, working with a team of appellate attorneys to expose the massive frame job Gary had orchestrated. During Gary's sentencing hearing, Hannah stood to address the court. Your Honor, Gary Becker was my father, and I loved him. But love doesn't excuse what he did to my mother, to Drew Whalen, to me, and to the justice system itself. He turned his own daughter into an unwitting accomplice in his revenge scheme. He corrupted federal agents and fabricated evidence to destroy innocent people. Hannah looked directly at Gary as she continued. My father taught me that actions have consequences. Today, he faces the consequences of his actions. Gary stared at his daughter, seeing himself reflected in her cold determination and strategic thinking. She'd become exactly what he'd tried to create, a ruthless tactical mind focused on achieving objectives. But now she was using those skills against him. The judge sentenced Gary to life in prison without possibility of parole. As he was led away, Hannah watched without emotion, her expression identical to Gary's during Casey's sentencing years earlier. 3 weeks later, Casey walked out of federal prison a free woman, her conviction overturned after evidence of the frame job was revealed. Hannah was waiting for her outside the gates. Mother and daughter embraced for the first time in 3 years, both crying as they tried to rebuild what Gary had destroyed. I'm sorry, Mom, Hannah whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. Casey held her daughter tight. "You saved me, Hannah. You saved us both." They drove away together, leaving the prison behind. Gary would spend the rest of his life in a cell, destroyed by the same ruthless methods he'd used against others. But in the end, Gary had succeeded in one objective he never intended. He'd created a daughter who was every bit as brilliant and merciless as himself. Hannah had simply chosen to use those qualities for justice instead of revenge. The war was over, and Gary Becker had lost everything. Epilogue. 2 years later, Hannah graduated from West Point with highest honors. Casey had rebuilt her life, working as an advocate for wrongfully convicted prisoners. They'd grown closer than ever, bonded by their shared survival of Gary's psychological warfare. Gary remained in federal prison, serving his life sentence in solitary confinement for his own protection. He'd received no visitors since his sentencing, no letters, no contact from the outside world. Hannah had kept one promise from their final conversation. She never forgave him. The rose garden Gary had planned to tear out still bloomed in their backyard, tended now by Casey and Hannah together. It served as a reminder that some things survive destruction, that love can endure even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. Gary Becker had been a master of revenge, but he'd underestimated the one opponent who knew all his tactics, the daughter he'd trained too well. In the end, the predator had become the prey, destroyed by his own creation. And Hannah Rhodes, no longer Hannah Becker, had learned the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the right choice is forgiving those who betray you and never forgiving those who teach you to hate. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.